All right, guys, let's talk about something a lot of people ask me. What actually happens when you break an intermittent fast with carnivore style foods like meat, eggs, and animal fats? Most people think fasting ends when the clock runs out, but in reality, the way you break that fast can make or break your results. If you choose the wrong foods, you can undo much of the benefit you just worked for. If you choose the right ones, you amplify it. Now, I've been practicing medicine for decades, working with patients struggling with obesity, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and all sorts of metabolic dysfunction. Over the years, I've watched people experiment with different fasting protocols, some breaking their fast with fruit, others with so-called healthy carbs, some with big salads, and some with steak and eggs. The difference in outcomes is undeniable. I've seen it clinically, and the science backs it up. When you reintroduce food after fasting, your body is highly sensitive. Insulin response, digestive function, and hormonal balance are all on high alert. This is why what you put in at that moment really matters. Break it with a high carb meal and you'll spike insulin, trigger cravings, and potentially drive fat storage. Break it with protein and fat from animal sources, and instead you stabilize blood sugar, blunt hunger, and extend the fat burning window you worked so hard to create. Today, we're going to dive into exactly why this happens and what it means for your results. There are 6 key things that take place when you break your fast with carnivore foods, from how your metabolism reacts to how your cravings disappear to what it does for inflammation and belly fat. These are the mechanisms I've seen in my patients and the ones that explain why combining fasting with a carnivore approach can be such a powerful tool for health and performance. When we look at what happens the moment you break a fast, the single biggest player is insulin. Insulin is that hormone that tells your body to store energy, and when it goes up dramatically, fat burning gets shut off. Now, the type of food you use to end that fast will determine how high insulin goes and for how long. If you break a fast with a bagel, some oatmeal, or a piece of fruit, your blood sugar shoots up quickly. That rise in blood sugar pushes insulin to spike, and what follows is a very predictable crash. People feel tired, hungry again, and often find themselves craving more carbohydrates. It's the classic roller coaster most of us have experienced. Contrast that with breaking a fast with steak, eggs, or some fatty fish. These are primarily protein and fat. They do require a small insulin response because insulin isn't just about carbs. It also helps shuttle amino acids from protein into cells. But here's the difference: that response is modest. Instead of a giant spike followed by a rapid crash, you get a gentle rise and a stable plateau. Your blood sugar doesn't swing wildly, and that means your energy levels remain steady. For someone trying to lose fat, this matters enormously, because if insulin doesn't surge, stay in that fat burning zone longer, even after the meal, I've seen this play out again and again with patients. Someone who breaks a fast with carbs often tells me they feel hungrier within 2 hours, even though they technically just ate. Their appetite regulation is completely disrupted. But someone who breaks their fast with ribeye and eggs, they'll report feeling satisfied for 6, 8, sometimes even 10 hours. That satiety effect is tied to the hormonal response, lower insulin, higher glucagon, and a steadier metabolic state. It's also worth noting how the post-meal crash plays into long-term success. If you've ever had that sleepy, sluggish feeling after a carb-heavy meal, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That happens because insulin drove glucose into your cells so quickly that blood sugar dropped too far, leaving your brain scrambling for energy. The natural response is to crave something sweet or starchy to bring sugar back up. That cycle not only makes fasting harder, but also makes fat loss harder, because you're constantly battling urges to snack. Breaking a fast with meat avoids that whole cascade. Energy remains even. The brain stays fueled with ketones and fatty acids, and you don't fall into that pit of chasing sugar all day. Another point people miss is that protein has a higher thermic effect than carbohydrates. What that means is your body burns more calories just to digest and process protein. So when you eat that steak after a fast, Not only are you avoiding a big insulin surge, you're also forcing your metabolism to work harder. It's like putting your fat burning machinery into overdrive. Fat from animal sources also slows digestion, which stretches out the absorption process. Instead of a flood of glucose hitting your bloodstream all at once, nutrients trickle in slowly and your body stays in balance. From a clinical standpoint, I've seen patients with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes reverse their blood sugar issues simply by changing what they used to break their fast. One man used to start his day with cereal after his 16-hour fast and would see his glucose shoot into the 200s. When he switched to eggs and bacon, his blood sugar barely moved. Over time, this consistent reduction in post-meal spikes lowered his average glucose, improved his insulin sensitivity, and he started losing body fat without feeling deprived. That is the power of using protein and fat as the entry point after fasting. And if we zoom out and think evolutionarily, it makes sense. Our ancestors weren't breaking a fast with orange juice and muffins. They were likely eating meat, fat, and maybe some organ foods. Their insulin stayed stable, energy was consistent, and that allowed them to function at a high level without the highs and lows modern diets create. So when you combine intermittent fasting with carnivore style refeeding, you're stacking the deck in your favor. Instead of canceling out the benefits of fasting by spiking insulin with carbs, you're extending the benefits. Fat burning continues, appetite is under control, energy doesn't crash, and your metabolism is working with you, not against you. One of the biggest mistakes people make with intermittent fasting is thinking the fast itself is all that matters. They'll white knuckle their way through 16, 18, even 24 hours without food, only to break the fast with something that sets them up for failure the rest of the day. The real secret isn't just how long you fast. Yeah. It's how you manage hunger once you start eating again. And this is where animal protein and fat have a clear advantage. When you break a fast with carbs, even the so-called healthy ones, you light up hunger hormones almost immediately. Carbohydrates stimulate insulin, and when insulin spikes, leptin signaling, the hormone that tells your brain you're full, gets disrupted. At the same time, ghrelin, your hunger hormone, comes roaring back as blood sugar swings. That's why people who break their fast with oatmeal, smoothies, or fruit often find themselves hungry again in just a couple of hours. They've essentially poured gasoline on their appetite rather than putting out the fire. Now compare that to a fast broken with steak, eggs, or some salmon. Protein and fat interact very differently with appetite hormones. Protein is by far the most satiating macronutrient, increases peptide I, YY, and GLP-1 hormones that send powerful satiety signals to the brain. Fat plays its role too, slowing gastric emptying so food stays in the stomach longer, and stabilizing blood sugar so you don't get that spike and crash cycle that triggers cravings. Together, they shut down hunger in a way carbs simply can't. Clinically, I've seen this over and over again. Patients who switch from breaking their fast with carbs to breaking it with protein and fat suddenly find they can go 6 to 8 hours without even thinking about food. One patient who used to snack every 2 hours told me, "I didn't even realize it was lunchtime until someone mentioned it." That's the kind of effortless control people are looking for, and it comes from how protein and fat modulate appetite hormones. There's also a psychological component. When cravings are driven by blood sugar swings, it feels like your willpower is failing you. You eat, then you crave, then you snack, and the cycle keeps repeating. But when hunger is quieted by nutrient-dense animal foods, you're not fighting yourself. Your brain isn't constantly nagging you to find something sweet. That mental relief is huge for consistency, because the number one reason people fail on fasting or dieting protocols is they just can't deal with being hungry all the time. Take away the hunger, and suddenly the plan is sustainable. If you've ever broken a fast with a ribeye and some eggs, you know what I mean. The fullness is different. It's not that bloated, uncomfortable fullness you get from a big carb heavy meal. It's a deep, lasting satiety that doesn't come with a crash afterward. You finish the meal and you're content, steady, and focused. That makes it easy to go about your day without thinking about the next snack or the next meal. Another interesting point is how protein and fat affect dopamine and reward pathways in the brain. Carbs, especially refined ones, tend to create a cycle of reward seeking. You eat them, you get a dopamine hit, and then you want more. Protein and fat don't drive that same addictive loop. They satisfy without overstimulating. This is another reason people on a carnivore approach often report their food addiction or sugar cravings finally disappearing. For people with weight loss goals, this is critical. The math is simple. The fewer times you eat, the fewer opportunities you have to overconsume calories. But you can only eat less often if you're truly satisfied between meals. That's why satiety is the cornerstone of success. And nothing I've seen in decades of practice matches the satiety power of meat, eggs, and animal fats. Think of fasting like building a fire. The fasting period is where you gather the wood and get the flame started. But what you feed the fire with afterward determines whether it keeps burning or fizzles out. Carbs are like throwing kindling on the fire. It burns hot but fast, and then you're left scrambling for more. Protein and fat are like solid logs, steady, long lasting, and reliable. Break your fast with those, and you've set yourself up for hours of steady energy, no hunger, and no cravings pulling you off track. This is why consistency suddenly becomes possible when you pair fasting with carnivore style eating. Instead of constantly fighting hunger, you're working with your body's natural satiety signals. The end result isn't just better appetite control for the day, but long-term adherence. And at the end of the day, consistency is what delivers real results. When you've been fasting, your digestive system has essentially been on a break. The gut isn't processing a constant stream of food. Bacteria populations shift, enzyme activity slows, and your stomach and intestines get a chance to rest. What you choose to eat after that period of rest makes a massive difference in how your body feels. And one of the most common issues people run into is breaking their fast with meals that are heavy in carbs and fiber. That combination often leads to bloating, gas, and discomfort that can undo the benefits of the fast. Carbohydrate heavy foods, especially those rich in fiber, ferment in the gut. When fiber and certain plant sugars reach the colon, bacteria feed on them and produce gas as a byproduct. If you've ever eaten a big bowl of beans, lentils, or even fibrous vegetables after a fast and felt your stomach balloon up, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The gut microbiome shifts during fasting, and when you suddenly flood it with fermentable substrates, that system isn't ready to handle the load. The result is bloating, distension, and sometimes even pain. Now compare that to breaking a fast with meat and eggs. Animal protein and fat are almost completely absorbed in the small intestine. By the time these foods move through digestion, there's very little left over to ferment in the colon. That means minimal gas production, minimal bloating, and a much smoother digestive experience. Patients often tell me they feel light and comfortable after a carnivore style refeed, whereas a carb-heavy refeed leaves them sluggish and gassy. Another factor is gut irritants. Plant foods often contain compounds like lectins, oxalates, and phytates, which can irritate the gut lining. After a fast, when your gut barrier is more sensitive, these compounds can trigger inflammation or discomfort. Animal foods don't come with those compounds. Meat, eggs, and fat are digested efficiently without causing irritation, which is one reason people with IBS or other digestive issues often find immediate relief on a carnivore diet. It's not just about what you're adding, it's about what you're not adding. No fermentable carbs, no gut irritating plant chemicals, no excess roughage for an already resting gut to process. There's also a hormonal and enzymatic angle to consider. When you eat carbs after a fast, you need enzymes like amylase to break them down and a surge of insulin to manage the glucose load. The gut has to ramp up activity quickly, which can stress the system. Protein and fat digestion relies more on stomach acid, bile, and proteolytic enzymes, which the body seems to maintain readiness for even during fasting. That's why people often tolerate animal-based refeed meals more smoothly. The digestive machinery for protein and fat is robust and adaptable even after a pause. I've seen countless patients with chronic bloating and gut discomfort discover that simply changing what they used to break their fast resolved their symptoms. One woman who struggled with bloating after every meal tried breaking her fast with a lean chicken breast and a couple of eggs. For the first time in years, she reported no stomach distension, no discomfort, just a calm, steady digestion. She later tried adding a salad back in after fasting, and the bloating immediately returned. That contrast shows how powerful food choice is when the gut is sensitive. Another point worth making is that people often equate fullness with bloating. They eat a fiber-heavy meal and think the stomach stretches satiety. But that's not real satiety, that's mechanical distension. With carnivore-style foods, you feel satisfied without the balloon effect because the satiety comes from hormones and nutrients, not from bulk sitting in the gut. That's why breaking a fast with steak feels so different than breaking it with a pile of vegetables or grains. For people with autoimmune conditions or leaky gut, the difference is even more profound. Fasting reduces gut permeability, giving the lining a chance to heal. If you slam it with inflammatory plant compounds right away, you can trigger flare-ups. If you ease back in with meat and eggs, you're reinforcing that healing process instead of undoing it. So, from a digestive perspective, breaking a fast with carnivore foods is simply easier on the system. You get the nutrients your body is craving, you avoid feeding gas-producing bacteria, you minimize irritants, and you give your gut the best chance to stay calm and efficient. It's no surprise that many people who struggle with digestive issues find fasting combined with carnivore to be one of the most comfortable and sustainable strategies they've ever tried. When people fast, one of the main goals is fat loss. They want to tap into stored energy, mobilize body fat, and ideally start shrinking that stubborn belly fat. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. The benefits of fasting can either be amplified or sabotaged depending on how you break the fast. If you refeed with carbohydrates, you can actually shut off fat burning almost instantly and shift your body back into storage mode. If you refeed with animal-based protein and fat, you keep fat adaptation rolling, and that means you get more mileage out of the hours you spent fasting. Carbohydrates push the body into glucose metabolism right away. As soon as glucose enters the bloodstream, insulin rises to shuttle it into cells. The problem is that insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone, it's also a storage signal. When insulin is elevated, fat oxidation, which is the burning of fat for fuel, grinds to a halt. So even if you just fasted for 16 or 18 hours, the moment you break that fast with bread, fruit, or grains, your body switches gears and prioritizes storing energy rather than burning it. This is why some people fast diligently but don't see the fat loss results they expect. They're canceling out the adaptation at the refeed point. Now look at what happens with a carnivore style refeed. Animal protein and fat have a very different effect on the body. They trigger only a modest insulin response, just enough to handle amino acids from the protein, but not enough to derail fat metabolism. The fat you consume provides steady energy without spiking blood sugar, and because your body has already been mobilizing fatty acids during the fast, it continues to do so seamlessly. In other words, the transition is smooth. Your body stays in fat burning mode. Instead of flipping the switch back to storage, you extend the fat adapted state well into the post-meal window. This has a direct impact on belly fat, which is the type of fat most people are most concerned about. Visceral fat around the midsection is particularly responsive to insulin. When insulin is elevated, belly fat is the first to get locked down. And when insulin is low, belly fat is the first to be mobilized. Patients I've worked with who consistently break their fasts with meat and eggs often notice the belly shrinking first. On the flip side, those who go back and forth between carb refeeds and fasting tend to stall. They never give the body long enough in fat burning mode to chip away at those reserves. There's also an appetite piece tied to fat loss. Carbohydrate refeeds often trigger cravings, leading people to eat more overall. Once the body is back in glucose mode, hunger signals ramp up and it's harder to maintain a calorie deficit. With carnivore refeeds, the opposite happens. Appetite is shut down, meals are less frequent, and caloric intake naturally regulates downward. Fat loss then becomes less about willpower and more about physiology doing the heavy lifting. From a clinical perspective, I've seen dramatic changes when patients make this simple shift. One man in his 50s who struggled with central obesity had been doing daily intermittent fasting, but breaking his fast with fruit and whole grains. His weight barely moved for months. When he switched to ribeye and eggs at the refeed, he dropped 3 inches from his waist in 8 weeks. Nothing else changed. The only difference was staying in fat adapted mode instead of flipping back to carb dependency after every fast. Another key point is energy stability. Fat metabolism produces ketones, which provide a steady, efficient fuel source. When you break your fast with fat and protein, ketone production continues, which not only supports brain clarity, but also encourages deeper fat utilization. When you refeed with carbs, ketone production is shut down, leaving you dependent on fluctuating glucose again. This back and forth robs the body of momentum and slows progress. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes perfect sense. Our ancestors likely didn't spend long periods of time in carb-fed states. They would go through periods of fasting or scarcity, then refeed on animal foods, keeping them in a fat-adapted state almost constantly. That's why the human body is so efficient at mobilizing fat and using ketones. What derails that system in modern times is the constant reliance on carbohydrates, especially right after fasting when the body is primed to keep burning fat. So if the goal is to burn belly fat, the smartest move is to align your refeed with the metabolic state you just created. Animal-based foods do that perfectly. They keep insulin low, appetite under control, and fat adaptation intact. Carbohydrates do the opposite. They shut off fat burning, promote storage, and often lead to overeating. The difference between those two choices is the difference between steady progress and ongoing frustration. When people think about fasting, they usually focus on weight loss or maybe blood sugar control. But what often surprises them is how strongly their energy levels and inflammation respond to what they eat after the fast. Over the years, I've watched hundreds of patients experiment with different approaches, and the pattern is clear: break the fast with carbohydrates, and you'll often see fatigue, brain fog, and inflammatory flare-ups. Break it with animal-based foods, and the outcome is completely different: higher energy, clearer thinking, and fewer aches, pains, or inflammatory symptoms. I remember a patient mid-40s who had been dealing with joint pain and fatigue for years. She started intermittent fasting and felt better during the fast itself, more alert, less pain. But every time she broke her fast with oatmeal, fruit, or a sandwich, she'd crash. Energy gone, joints aching, brain fog creeping in. We switched her refeed to ribeye and eggs, and the difference was almost immediate. She told me, "I finally feel like fasting isn't undoing itself." Her inflammation markers improved, her pain decreased, and she reported steady energy throughout the day instead of that roller coaster. This isn't just anecdotal. Carbohydrates drive post-meal inflammation in many people, especially those with insulin resistance or autoimmune issues. When blood sugar spikes, inflammatory pathways get activated, oxidative stress increases, and you can literally feel it in your body as fatigue or soreness. On the other hand, carnivore-style refeeds don't create that same inflammatory burden. Protein and fat don't spike glucose the way carbs do, and they don't push insulin high enough to trigger those inflammatory cascades. That's why patients so often describe feeling lighter and clearer after an animal-based refeed. Brain fog is another area where the difference shows up clearly. When someone breaks a fast with carbs, they'll often feel mentally sharp for about 20-30 minutes, and then the fog rolls in. That's the post-meal crash. Blood sugar plummets, the brain struggles for fuel, and concentration disappears. With a carnivore-style refeed, the opposite happens. Ketone production continues, fatty acids stay available as fuel, and the brain has a steady supply of energy. Patients describe it as calm focus, not jittery, not wired, just sustained clarity. A businessman I worked with said, His productivity doubled when he switched to steak and eggs for his first meal after fasting. No crash, no coffee needed in the afternoon, just consistent mental sharpness. Inflammation doesn't just show up in labs or in vague terms, it shows up in real symptoms. Migraines, skin flare, ups, joint swelling, digestive irritation, all of these are tied to inflammatory responses after eating. I've seen people eliminate years of nagging issues simply by choosing to end their fast with carnivore foods. One patient with psoriasis noticed his flare-ups dramatically decreased when he dropped the carb refeeds. Another with rheumatoid arthritis cut her morning stiffness in half by switching to beef and eggs. These aren't isolated stories. They're patterns that repeat across patients and across backgrounds. Energy is the most practical benefit people notice. It's not uncommon for people to say, I thought fasting made me tired, but it wasn't the fast, it was how I broke it. When they use carbs, energy disappears. When they use protein and fat, they feel recharged. The body isn't being jerked around by glucose highs and lows, it's running on a stable, fat-based fuel. That stability means no afternoon crashes, no desperate snacking for a pick-me-up, and no feeling like the day is running you instead of the other way around. And when inflammation is reduced, recovery improves. I've had athletes notice their soreness goes down, their joints feel better, and they can train harder the next day. Office workers report that their back pain or neck stiffness lessens. Even people dealing with autoimmune flares see reduced symptoms. It all ties back to one thing, breaking the fast with foods that support stability instead of triggering chaos. What's remarkable is that people usually don't believe it until they try it. They assume fasting itself is doing all the work, but once they experiment with how they break the fast, it becomes obvious. Carbs undo much of the progress. Animal foods extend it. The patients who consistently choose carnivore refeeds aren't just losing weight, they're functioning better, thinking more clearly, and living with less pain. That's the real world impact, and it's why this combination of fasting and animal-based eating is so powerful for everyday life. Whenever we talk about breaking a fast with carnivore-style foods, it's easy to focus only on the benefits: stable energy, reduced inflammation, better satiety, and improved fat loss. But like anything, there are potential pitfalls if you don't do it correctly. I've seen patients make mistakes that slow their progress or make them feel worse than they should, and it's worth addressing these challenges up front. The good news is, with a little awareness and some practical adjustments, most of these issues are easy to avoid. One of the most common problems I see is overeating. After a long fast, appetite hormones can be heightened, and if you dive straight into a massive plate of fatty cuts, it's easy to overshoot. People tell me they break a fast with ribeye bacon and eggs, and then they feel sluggish or overly full afterward. The problem isn't the food itself, it's the sheer volume consumed all at once. A practical fix is to start the refeed modestly. Think of it as easing the digestive system back into gear. A few eggs, a smaller portion of steak, or even something like bone broth with a bit of fat can prime the system before you move into a bigger meal later. Patients who take this gradual approach report less discomfort and better energy. Electrolytes are another piece that can't be overlooked. During fasting, the body flushes sodium, potassium, and magnesium more readily, especially as insulin stays low and the kidneys excrete more salt. If you break a fast without replenishing electrolytes, you can feel weak, lightheaded, or even crampy. This isn't the food's fault. It's a hydration and mineral issue. I always recommend adding a pinch of salt to your first meal, drinking mineral water, or using an electrolyte supplement if you're doing extended fasts. Something as simple as salting your steak generously can make the difference between feeling drained and feeling recharged. Another challenge is digestive adjustment. While carnivore foods are generally easier on the gut than fiber-heavy carbs, some people experience temporary discomfort if they refeed with very fatty cuts right away. Too much rendered fat after fasting can overwhelm the digestive enzymes and bile production, leading to loose stools or stomach upset. The way around this is to balance your first refeed with both protein and fat rather than going all in on fat. For example, eggs and leaner cuts of beef or fish, followed by fattier cuts later in the day, tend to be tolerated much better. Over time, the body adapts and most people can handle higher fat loads comfortably. But pacing yourself at the start is key. There's also the issue of monotony. People sometimes hear break your fast with meat and eggs and think that means the exact same plate every single time. While simplicity is a strength of the carnivore approach, variety within those animal-based options can make the diet more enjoyable and sustainable. Rotating between beef, lamb, fish, eggs, or even organ meats ensures you get a broader spectrum of nutrients and avoids palate fatigue. Patients who mix things up tend to stick with the plan longer and report fewer cravings. One subtle mistake I see is using dairy as the main refeed. Yes, cheese and cream are technically animal-based, but they can be calorie-dense and easy to overconsume without offering the same satiety as whole cuts of meat. For people prone to overeating or stalling fat loss, I recommend prioritizing meat and eggs as the base and treating dairy as an accessory, not the main dish. Some individuals also struggle with expectations. They hear the benefits of carnivore refeeds and assume every fast will feel amazing as long as they follow the rules. But the body is dynamic. Stress, sleep, and activity all affect how you feel when you refeed. If one day you feel a little off, it doesn't mean the approach isn't working. It means you may need to adjust electrolytes, portion size, or timing. The key is paying attention to feedback from your body rather than forcing a rigid formula. Finally, it's worth reminding people that breaking a fast isn't about perfection. It's about setting yourself up for the best possible continuation of the benefits you worked for. If you lean toward protein and fat, keep portions reasonable at first, salt your food, and avoid flooding your system with carbs, you'll extend the fat burning energy and anti-inflammatory effects of fasting. Done right, the combination of fasting and carnivore style refeeds isn't just powerful, it's sustainable long term because you're not fighting hunger, energy crashes, or digestive issues.